I've always loved fantasy. As a child, I wanted nothing more than to be whisked away to a magical, far-off land filled with larger-than-life characters, strange and wonderful creatures, and grand mysteries to be unraveled. That's never really changed as I've grown up. What better way to escape the mundane life of school, work, and taxes than to curl up with a good fantasy book and lose yourself in an impossible tale? I first dipped my grubby little hands into the genre with Del Toro Quest. Then, like every other literate person in the world at that time, I moved on to Harry Potter. I was hooked. If it had knights, quests, magic, and dragons, I was in. Eventually, my older brother introduced me to a particular series of books that ticked all of my boxes. It had prophecies. It had a regular farm boy who turned out to be magical and important. It had sorcerers, evil plots, a whole cast of wacky characters, and one big long quest. It was called The Belgariad, and it was written by a man named David Eddings. When I first read The Belgariad, I loved it. I thought it was the most gripping, original, well-crafted piece of fantasy fiction I'd ever seen. So, naturally, I read the sequel series, The Malorian, as well. Then I read Belgarath the Sorcerer, then Polgara the Sorceress, then the Revan Codex. I would rave to my friends about the world and the characters. I would fan-cast movie adaptations. I was obsessed. But then I moved on. I read other series, and found other worlds to immerse myself in. It was a long time before I revisited the Belgariad and some of Eddings' other books. When I did, I started with The Redemption of Althalis. It's a standalone novel, and again, as a kid, I loved it. But upon rereading it as an adult, it's tonally strange, paced terribly, filled with awful dialogue, and way too long. This is just the very tip of the iceberg that I'm going to reveal to you. Don't get me wrong. There's a lot to like about these stories. They were popular for a reason, and they were very influential in the genre. But I wouldn't be making this video if there wasn't a lot to talk about. So before we begin, I want to bring up just a few things. The first is actually a trigger warning, because later in the video I will be talking about some things that could be confronting or triggering, including sexual assault, abuse, and rape. I'll put timestamps on the screen so you can skip those sections if you like, but just know that they will be coming up later. The second is just laying down some ground rules about how this video is going to work. So when I was researching for this video, I decided to focus on the Belgariad, the Malorian, their supplemental materials, and the Redemption of Althalis. Those are the books I read as a kid, and those made the most sense to revisit, especially in a video about nostalgia. I tried to read the Elenium and the Tamuli when I was younger, but I never really got into them that much, and I only reread a few chapters for this video. So I read these books that I'd once loved so much, and I took notes on my grievances as I did so. As I read, my notes grew and grew, and as my notes grew, I felt that flame of nostalgic joy dwindle. There were a lot of notes to support the suspicions I had. A lot. In fact, you can see me transfer my notes into categories and mark the relevant passages as I speak. Even that was a long process. So I know I've beaten around the bush a lot in this intro, and I'd love to dive right into all the discoveries I made about my former favourite author, but first I think I have to set the scene. The Belgariad is about Garion, a farm boy with a strange mark on his palm. He's raised by his Aunt Pol, and the farm that he lives on gets frequent visits from an old storyteller Garion affectionately names Mr. Wolf. As the story progresses, we learn that these two are actually Polgara the Sorceress and Belgarath the Sorcerer, two of the oldest and most powerful people in the world. As they embark on their inevitable quest into the outside world, they pick up more characters from the other kingdoms that David Eddings has created. There's a barbarian, there's a rogue, a fighter, another fighter, and the scariest companion of them all, a woman. Okay, well, she's not a woman. She's 15. Her name's Senedra, and she's a literal child. That will be important later. They journey across the kingdoms of the West in search of the Orb of Aldur, a magical MacGuffin that's been stolen from the throne room at Riva to be taken to the evil god Torak. It's all very dramatic. Over the course of the 5-book series, Garion learns to use the will and the word, which is how Polgara and Belgarath practice their sorcery. He meets a whole host of powerful characters, and he learns about his own strange prophesied destiny. To marry Senedra, to become the king of Riva, and to wield the Orb of Aldur against Torak, to kill the dragon god of the Anger Axe. Now that's a very simplified version of the story, and there are a lot of names, locations and events that I will go into further detail for a bit later, but we'll get to it. For now, that's all you need to know about the Belgariad. The Malorian uses many of the same characters as the Fellowship of the Orb, because the story centers around Garion again, except this time he's got a cool new name, Belgarion. He's been king for a while and someone's nicked his son, so he and the others go after him, and eventually they learn that the kidnapper was someone named Xandramas. She's bad news. Naturally, she goes all over the world, so we can get another tour of all the different kingdoms, and then we come to the second, final, epic, ultimate battle between good and evil, which culminates in Eriond, a child introduced in the Belgariad, becoming the new god of the Anger Axe. Belgarath the Sorcerer and Polgara the Sorceress are written as personal memoirs from each character's perspective, accounting their thousands of years of escapades. They're pretty alright, and they're fairly low stakes, so they're more of a cozy read than some of the mainline series entries. Now we get to Althalas. The redemption of Althalas is about a thief who gets hired to steal a book from a house. Good setup. Instead, a goddess in the form of a cat traps him in the house and teaches him how to read the book, which turns out to be God's book. This gives him magical powers, and thus he goes out into the world to collect a bunch of wacky characters and lead them on a merry chase through all the kingdoms that Eddings has created. They then use the book's magic and the magic of friendship to foil the evil god Deva's plans, turn back time to fix a bunch of mistakes they made, and have a big, climactic battle at the end to defeat the bad guys once and for all. So, now that we have at least a basic understanding of some of the overarching plot lines from the stories I'm talking about, I think it's time to get started. Often in fantasy, you see a very whitewashed version of racism. People might discriminate against elves for being cold and aloof, then flip when they realise that they're just immortal and live apart from humanity, and that not every elf is the same. They might label dwarves as rough and blunt, then flip when they realise that perhaps they're just direct and practical, and that not every dwarf is the same. They'll think that Muggleborns can't properly do a magic, then realise they can properly do a magic. Sean, one of my favourite YouTubers, has a great video that includes that last point. Anyway, you get the idea. I'm not naming names, but it's very basic stuff, and it's not really reflective of real-world racism at all. But we're not even dealing with that toe-stubbing level of competency and subtlety today. So what am I talking about here? I never met David Eddings when he was alive, and I still haven't met him now that he's dead, so am I calling him a racist? Probably. Am I calling his writing racist? Actually yes, but let me fully explain what I mean. As you read the Belgariad and the Malorian, you'll encounter several different kingdoms and, naturally, the people that populate them. Now, David, if I may be so bold as to call him by his first name for a video he's far too deceased to ever watch, likes to take inspiration from real-world places and eras for his kingdoms and world building. So you'll come to realise that Sendars correspond to rural Englishmen, Arrans to Norman French, Tolnedrans to Romans, Kerriks to Vikings, Algars to Cossacks, Ulgos to Jews, and Angaraks to Hunnish Mongolian Muslim Visigoths out to convert the world by the sword. There are a few contextual and in-text examples that I drew these conclusions from. For example, Sendars are practical and sensible and of mixed background. The Arrans are noble to a fault and romantic and all speak in flowery language. The Tolnedrans are obsessed with commerce. They're an empire. They have legions as their armed forces, and they build all the roads. Kereks are big, burly sailors who live on a cold, snowy northern island and go berserk in a fight. Algars have horses, I guess? Ulgos are very religious as a community, and that's also kind of it. Where did I get this from? The Angarax, of course, are universally awful, irredeemable, mostly stupid, hell-bent on destroying the Western world, ugly, brutal, and deserve to be genocided. Just going off the books here. The other piece of textual evidence is that David Eddings simply tells us this in the Revan Codex, a kind of world-building journal that he published. From page 14, the Sendars correspond to rural Englishmen, the Arans to Norman French, the Tolnedrans to Romans, the Kereks to Vikings, the Algars to Cossacks, the Ulgos to Jews, and the Angarax to Hunnish Mongolian Muslim Visigoths, out to convert the world by the sword. So that pretty much clears it up, doesn't it? So he uses real-world parallels. So what? Well, I actually have nothing against drawing from the real world, or using historical allegory, or even shamelessly ripping off Tolkien, but the way Eddings sets up his fantasy races is a little more than just harmless comparison. Some of the traits I listed before might sound fairly benign. The Tolnedrans built all the roads. The Kereks are really good at sailing and fighting. The Sendars are practical. But the more observant viewers might have noticed a little something negative about the Angarax. I mean, apart from the strange smashing together of like 4 different cultures. Let's talk about them. Do you want to talk about the Angarax? There are several races of Angarax. There are Nadrax, who are merchants. There are Murgos, who are warriors. There are the Malorians, who are pretty much everything because Meloria is really big. And then there are the Tools, who are workers. At least, that's how they're described in prologues. What happens when we look at the rest of the books and see how our characters describe them? Gethel's a Tull through and through. There's nothing between his ears but sand. A Tull doesn't have the mental equipment to be a spy, so the Grolums have to do it themselves. King Nathal of Mishrak Gaktul was a slack-lipped, dull-eyed young man with lank, mud-coloured hair and a profound lack of anything even remotely resembling intelligence. David talks about his uncomprehending eyes, his dull face, his incurious face. Unrak was exploring, and close on his heels was Nathal, the slack-faced young king of the Tulls. Tulls were too stupid to set up anything even resembling a government. Tulls have what you might call a very limited sense of direction. Tulls have a very limited grasp of just about anything. It takes the average Tull a half a day just to tie his shoes. Tulls are too stupid to pose much of a threat. Some of these examples are narration. This is how David Eddings imagines the Tulls in his head. We can confirm this with further quotes from the Revan Codex where he directly tells the reader that the Tulls are stupid. Tulls tend to be broad of shoulder, wide-backed, thick-hipped, and somewhat slow-witted. Then he tells us again. Tulls tend to be stupid. Village life is about all they are really capable of. Then he tells us again. Tulls are not bright enough to have very much in the way of elaborate etiquette. Dude, what do you have against the Tulls? You might think it sounds a little jarring to have all this information I've collected thrown at you at once. While I'm sure that's true, you definitely notice as you're reading the books that the Tulls only ever get brought up to tell you either how stupid they are, or to tell you that they're basically slaves to be religiously sacrificed at a moment's notice. If a Tull shows up in person, which they very seldom do, it's to be sacrificed, to be saved from being sacrificed, or to do something stupid. Let's move on to the Nadrax. Honestly, they don't get mentioned that much. In Enchanter's Endgame, Garion goes to Garog Nadrak for the first time. It's the first Angarak kingdom he's ever been in, and right off the bat, the first town he visits is perhaps the ugliest town Garion had ever seen. This is the 5th book. They've been to dozens of towns and cities across Arendia, Sendaria, Tolnedra, Kerek, and all the other western kingdoms, but the first time he visits an Angarak kingdom, Garion has to cover his precious little eyes. The entire settlement seemed to reflect an attitude of good enough that offended Garion for some reason. Nadrax didn't seem to be so bad once he got past the crudity of their nature. So as you read, you see that Nadrax are basically all smelly, drunken scam artists. Eddings doesn't go on about it quite as much as he goes on about the Tulls being dumb as rocks, but they're definitely painted in a negative light. Although, to give credit where credit is due, there are a few Nadrak characters on the good side. Yarblek is a merchant who works with silk, and he helps out the main cast a fair bit, but he's also a slimy drunkard who tries to cheat everyone he ever does business with. The other is Vela, a peasant woman who is way overly sexualized, but otherwise is pretty good. For those of you that have read the series, you know that the Nadrax have another problem, and it is a doozy. It's so big it has its own section later in the video, but we'll get there. I'll give you a hint though, it rhymes with schmavery, and it ain't courage. So, with the Nadrax shelved for now, let's move on to the Malorians. Yeah, they're kind of boring. Big place, lots of cultures, but they're all pretty segregated, so not much to say. The Murgos. This is the big one. The supposed warrior race, the Murgos are the main racial foe of the Alorns. That's people from Kerek, Drasnia, Algaria, and Riva, for those unacquainted. They're a pretty big part of the story, so how are they described in the books? The Murgos have no real interest in trade, Wolf explained. Nadrax are merchants, but the Murgos are warriors. The Murgos pose as merchants for the same reason we pose as wagoneers, so that they can move about more or less undetected. If you simply assume that all Murgos are spies, you wouldn't be too far from the truth. Murgos don't have honest business, Aunt Pole told him. Every Murgo in Tol Nedra is here because he was sent by the Grolam High Priest. There were a lot of Murgos in Sendaria pretending to be merchants, but they weren't really. They were spies. So the Murgo merchants in the West can't possibly be actual merchants looking to make money or connections or just be anywhere other than Ithol Murgos. No, they have to be sleeper agents. All of them. Good start. Some of this comes from our main characters. Tell us what you really think, guys. I killed my first Murgo when I was 10, Hetar went on in the same flat voice. He was trying to escape from us, and I rode him down and put a javelin between his shoulders. Getting rid of the Murgos has been one of my main goals in life. You know, Silk said, that's the first time I've ever seen a Murgo actually work. I didn't think they even knew how. Look, motherfucker, you spent the last chapter of the last book on a Murgo ship. There were Murgos working all around you, all day. How could you possibly think? I've met a few Murgos, and I've never encountered one that I liked. They are a most unlovable race, it seemeth to me. Indeed they are, your grace, and their god is even worse. After that, Zakath became obsessed with the idea of exterminating the Murgo race. A commendable goal, I suppose, but it did sort of get in the way when more important things were going on. What about Angarax in general? How do the good guys feel about them? Angarak names are so universally ugly that my master did him a favour when he renamed him. The last place in the world you would look for beauty would be in the mind of an Angarak. There are worse things than war, Barak said grimly. It might be a good opportunity to dispose of the Angarax once and for all. Let's exterminate the Angarax once and for all. Okay, I think I speak for everyone when I say, what on earth is going on? Some of these thoughts of gleeful genocide come from our main cast, our heroes. And believe me, this is a heavily cherry-picked list. I could have gone on for far longer. The way I see it, there are only really two explanations. The first is that our heroes are seriously, deeply flawed, with very questionable morals. This could have been quite interesting, I think. It could have led to some inner and interpersonal conflicts, a lot of character growth, and perhaps even some general societal betterment. The second, far more accurate possibility is that all of these outlandish and racist suspicions are proved to be both correct and justified by the events of the story. How unbelievably disappointing. In fact, it's not just disappointing, it's frustrating, because there was a real opportunity here to keep these genocidal comments and racist stereotypical habits and turn them into something, but it never eventuates. I know it would have been simplistic and cliche, but at least it would have been something. Simple truth is that not once over the course of these 12 books are these grand, sweeping statements about the entire Angarak race ever disproven, challenged, or properly called out. Not once are the genocidal aspirations of our heroes ever satisfactorily questioned or scrutinized. The stereotypes are proven right time after time. Race trumps all. Garion sees a Murgo merchant in the first few chapters of the entire series, and Belgarath, the sorcerer and mentor, thousands of years old, shown to be great and clever and wise and worldly, surmises that this Mergo cannot possibly be a merchant. He has to be a spy. And guess what? He's right. In fact, the first two Mergos that Garyon ever meets are both shady dickheads in league with each other for evil purposes. They can't just be merchants. They have to be evil. Race trumps all. Every Mergo they meet later on is reporting back to someone sinister, or waiting to ambush and kill the heroes, or just a priest of the evil god Torak in disguise. It robs the books of quite a lot of tension because you know what's up the second you see one of those fuckers on the page. As I said, the Tolls are really no better. They only show up to do something stupid or be sacrificed. There's not a single Toll with even half of a brain. Never mind that this would have clearly caused a total societal collapse thousands of years ago. Race trumps all. It's the same with the Nadrax. They're an entire race of drunken, swindling scammers. And a secret hidden other thing that we'll talk about later. The stereotypes are as universal as they are immutable. So there exists an argument for this type of world building, and it goes like this. Yeah, but it's like meant to be simple, you know? Just like orcs in Lord of the Rings. Besides, it's not real anyway, so why does it matter? Okay, I know I've just created a straw man, but not only have I seen people say similar things online, but I also wanted to play devil's advocate and properly explain why I have an issue with what David Eddings has done here. My problem with this goes beyond the fact that none of the characters grow in this regard. It goes beyond the lazy world building that leads to constant shattering of immersion. My real complaint is with the fact that this is a terrible theme and a terrible message to have in a series for readers of any age. But I know that these books are geared towards younger audiences, so that makes it worse. I'm not saying that kids are going to read the Belgariad once and start yelling slurs on the street and calling for a return of segregation. However, it's not a very heroic trait for these characters to have, and not one that I would want my kids to look up to. I also don't think this should be ignored by the characters within the story or the readers themselves. The way that the races of Eddings' world are presented aren't just lazy, they're reflective of an oversimplification of culture that feels borderline disrespectful. You may be asking yourself, what's the big deal? It's fantasy, right? Well, David Eddings has told us in the Revan Codex that these places are almost direct allegories for real-world places and cultures. Maybe they're not modern places and cultures, but it's still a shitty way to go about it. There are more examples, and the next biggest one is the Arryns. I mentioned earlier that they correspond to the Norman French. Now in the main two series, there are two types of Arryns. The Asturians, who are bowmen and live in the forests like rangers, and the Mimbrates, who are heavily armoured mounted knights, who live in big castles like winners. Oh, and the Mimbrates talk funny. Superficial differences aside, they are all noble, hot-headed, overly proud, and, most importantly, as brainless as a lobotomized jellyfish. Arryns, of course, were very brave, but were also notoriously thick-witted. Runderig is an Arrynd, Garyon said. He sometimes seems to be, well, not too quick of thought, if you know what I mean. Runderig's Arryndish background made his mind move rather slowly. He's a Mimbrate Arrynd, Belden snorted. He doesn't have enough brains to be afraid. The intermarriage with the Dals has altered certain of the more irritating Arryndish tendencies, such as gross stupidity for one thing. Belden reported that the Arryns had grown even more stupid, if that's possible. So they're stupid and everyone knows it. They're just like tools, except because they're the good guys, they get to have some other character traits as well. Again, these stereotypes of bravery and idiocy force them into rigid and predictable boxes. There are no Arryns that buck the trend and rise above their kinsmen to become savvy merchants or clever advisors, or even halfway to the mental capacity we see constantly from Alorns, Tolnedrans, Nyissans, Sendars. You get the picture. It doesn't stop there. Tolnedrans are all greedy and obsessed with money. Drasnians are sneaky little spies. The Nyissans worship their snake god so hard that they basically are snakes, and they're all obsessed with poison and betrayal. They all have a little stereotype that gets repeated over and over, even by the people of the kingdoms themselves. So why did I zero in so hard on the Angarax? Well, first of all, they are the unequivocal villains of the piece, so there's a lot of material to draw from. But there's also another reason more related to this chapter of the video. Now, Dave wrote the Belgariad in the 80s, where I suppose fantasy authors just weren't used to the fact that non-white people exist, so it won't shock you to learn that this world he's created is crazy white. Like fresh snow on the Swiss Alps, white. In fact, there's only one group of people in this story who are verifiably non-white. Would it shock you at all to learn that these people are the Angaraks? Was your head turned off, Ghislaine? Couldn't you tell by the colour of his skin and the shape of his eyes that he's an Angarak? Their eyes had a peculiar angularity to them. They had swarthy skin, prominent cheekbones, and narrow, angular eyes. Yep, so the Angaraks have darker skin and angular eyes, and are the only race to be described this way. Even if you weren't on board with my earlier point about the immutable stereotypes not being a great message, I'm sure you'll agree that casting the only non-white characters as universal villains with constant reminders as to how awful they are and consistently suggesting they get genocided is pretty piss poor. And there's really no time period or allegorical excuse for this. It's just bad and racist, and it's an embarrassing stain on the genre that needs to die. Much of the textual Angarak hatred is concentrated on the Murgos, the supposed warrior race, which makes them the figurehead for this endless religious war between the East and the West. Their entire existence is rendered nonsensical and paradoxical by their absurd societal structure. There are no Murgo merchants? How do they conduct trade? How does their economy exist? All Murgos living abroad are spies? How have they not been thrown out of the kingdoms yet, or just murdered? I know these questions sound like real nitpicks, because they are, but it would take so little effort from a writing standpoint to make these non-issues. Allow me to present a point I think perfectly encapsulates my argument. Throughout the 12 books, we see likeable Nadraks. We see our heroes form a strong bond with Zakath, the Emperor of Meloria, and plenty of his people. The Tulls barely exist, so don't worry about them. There are zero good or even sympathetic Murgos until King of the Murgos, the second book of the second series. So we're on our 7th one, and we finally get to Urgot, the king. Our heroes meet him, and they hit it off immediately. He's reasonable, he's clever, he's level-headed, he's got a good sense of humour. This is great. It's too little too late, but it's something, it's progress, and it feels like a learning moment for the characters who, up until now, have always assumed that every Murgo they meet is a dirty, no-good, rotten scoundrel who'll cut their throat the second he's not a Murgo. Well, he's half Murgo, but he's actually the half-brother of Silk, another one of our main characters who just so happens to be a prince of Drasnia, so he's half Drasnian. The first good Murgo we meet in the entire fucking story, and he's not even a full Murgo. He looks like Silk. He talks like Silk. He acts like Silk, and it invalidates all of his Murgoism. For all intents and purposes, he is a Drasnian, despite having grown up as a Murgo in Thol Murgos, surrounded by Murgos everywhere he looks. Race trumps all. To play devil's advocate, there are actually 3 other good Murgo characters introduced alongside Urgot. His mother, his chief advisor, and his underage love interest. The love interest only exists to fall in love with the king and marry him, so she's out. His mother is basically only presented in the story and presented as good due to her connection to Silk's father, a Drasnian, so she's out too. That just leaves us with the advisor, who actually is pretty cool. So I guess I was wrong. There's 2 good Murgo characters in the whole series. In case you're wondering if this is an isolated incident, it's not. Things are pretty much exactly the same in Redemption of Althalis, where Nequeros is another entire country of pure evil, and the Arams describe themselves as illiterate barbarians. So now that we've covered that pretty heavy first topic, let's move on to something more lighthearted and fun. I lied. So there's a trend amongst male writers, especially male fantasy writers, where they seem to write female characters quite poorly. There's an entire subreddit about this phenomenon. It's a very well-known issue. Now, this has got better over time, but not perfect, and David Eddings did write these books a fairly long time ago. In other works, this might show up as overlong descriptions of characters' physical features or genitals, sexualization of literal children, or gratuitous sexual violence that doesn't really serve the plot or characters in any meaningful way, and seems to only be there for some strange authorial sense of gratification. David Eddings is sometimes more subtle than this. Sometimes. The first taste we get is in the prologue of the first book. Now when Polgara and Beldaran had reached their 16th year, the spirit of Aldur came to Belgarath in a dream, saying, "Choose, therefore, which of thy daughters thou wilt give to the Revan king to be his wife and the mother of his line." So Dave serves us up this slice of sexist cake right out of the gate, and while it's not the most revolting dish in this category, it's got a few layers to it. Firstly, Belgarath's daughters just turned 16, and Reva, the king, is in his mid to late 30s. Secondly, Belgarath is choosing one of his daughters to give to this middle-aged man, to be the mother of his babies. Not to take them there and meet him to see if these literal children hit it off with a grown adult they've never met. No, picking one to hand over like a family heirloom. So I feel I need to give a bit of an explanation in case anyone watching isn't fully on board with what I'm saying. Yes, I understand that this shit used to happen in real life all the time. Yes, I understand that the age differences and the manner of this arrangement is a staple in fantasy to this day. I'm not saying old Davey is a misogynist just because he included this section. However, the fact that nobody questions this arrangement in narrative, as well as the fact that Belgarath considers sending Polgara as a punishment for Reva, as well as Beldaran and Reva falling in love instantly the first time they meet, as well as Beldaran being ecstatic about the entire arrangement, as well as Polgara being made out to be the stubborn dickhead when she is the only one to object to this marriage, kind of makes me lean towards a misogynistic verdict. Much like the examples of racism, there are many cases of male characters being openly sexist, which, again, very common in the genre, but what makes it especially not good is that these characters rarely, if ever, get called out for these opinions or grow out of them at all. A prudent man does not give either a priest or a woman the opportunity to scold him in public. Are they all like that? He demanded of Garion. All what? Females. Tupik said the word with a certain disgust. That's better, Zakath sighed. But is it really safe to talk to that stone that way? You have to be firm. It's like a dog or a horse sometimes. Or even a woman. This is what I'm talking about. Characters belittle and degrade women in general from the very start of the series to the very end. No characters learn better and stop talking like this. It doesn't help that it's only ever women who acknowledge these comments, never the men. The women who happen to overhear might gently scold the man who said it, and then everything goes back to normal and nothing changes. For anyone watching this video who thinks that this point isn't a big deal, firstly, just wait. We are not even close to done. And secondly, just like in the previous chapter, these characters are supposed to be heroic and good and just. These are some pretty shitty ideals to have.
It's not just the characters who feel this way, though. The narration itself often makes comments, which feels like David popping in every now and then to vent his frustrations with or insights about women. And then the dressmakers arrived, and Polgara and the other ladies were whisked away to engage in that activity which, Garion had noticed, always seems to fill the feminine heart with a kind of dreamy bliss. Like every woman who had ever lived since the beginning of time, she smugly enjoyed her husband's suffering. Dwyer, Undine, and Latha were deep in a discussion about hairstyles. The ladies took a while, quite a while, to dress for dinner. Regardless of who they are, what's at stake, or what they're doing, Dave has to remind us that women can and will get distracted by hair, clothing, or making their husbands miserable. Seriously, some of these quotes come from scenes where other characters are in the middle of doing really important things, but the women just can't help themselves. Now, Belgariad fans among you may be saying that all is not lost, because Eddings does write some good, progressive female characters, and you might even point to Polgara as being one such character. Unfortunately, I disagree. Being that she is the most prominent female character in the whole saga, She acts as a kind of lightning rod for all of the misogyny throughout the series, including from Dave himself. "Hail Belgarath, disciple of Aldor," Unhag said, "and hail Lady Polgara, honoured daughter of immortal Belgarath." She's a disciple of Aldor too. Why does she have to be daughter of Belgarath instead of one of her many titles? Belgarath often infantilizes her, completely independent of the fact that she's his daughter. He says that her supposed girlishness makes her less clever, and implies that her womanhood makes her less competent sometimes. He's known her for thousands of years. I feel like he should know her better. Well, he would, if he weren't proven correct by the way that Dave writes her. Just like he writes races into stereotypes, he writes Polgara into a caricature. Instead of her womanhood and the other traits of her gender being an inherent part of her value, strength, power, and wisdom, her success is in spite of it. What Dave seems to focus on more is her potential for motherhood. Protecting those little boys wasn't the only reason she'd been born, but it was certainly one of the important ones. Get this, Aunt Pol had always been at the very centre of his life, and with the birth of her twins, her life was now fulfilled. Oh, sick! The story's always telling us how unfulfilled Polgara is throughout her journey, so this is a nice capstone. It's almost annoying how much Dave brought up how empty she felt, how she yearned for something more, and how kids would have really made those thousands of years make sense. Obviously, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with having children, or having characters who want to have children, but this fulfillment comes out of nowhere. It's treated as if it's a goal she's been working towards her entire life. Plus, she's already mothered the Revan line for centuries. Hasn't she earned a rest? Polgara is also the subject of a very strange event that happens towards the end of the Belgariad. Dernick, a blacksmith who she's fallen in love with, dies, so she begs the gods who are present to bring him back so she can marry him, but they tell her that such a marriage could never work. "Marriage must be a joining of equals, my daughter. How could this good, brave man be husband to thee, so long as thy power remains?" What they're referring to is the fact that Polgara is a sorceress, and Dernick doesn't have this power, so he'd feel like too much of a tiny little baby man if they got married because they're not equal enough. Polgara agrees to give up her power to get Dernick back, because, as previously stated, they couldn't possibly get married while she was so powerful and he was not. Polgara took the faithful smith Dernick as her husband, since the gods had raised him from the dead and had given him the power of sorcery to be her equal. So the gods pulled a fast one and just gave Dernick powers as well. Happy endings all round. But why is this necessary? It's not a problem for anyone else in the series. Garion marries Sinedra when she has no magical ability, and he's basically Magic Jesus. You could make the argument that she has political power because she's a Tolnedran princess, but again, Magic Jesus. But fine, if you think that's not a good example, take Belden and Vela. Belden is thousands of years old. He's a powerful disciple of Aldor, just like Belgarath and Polgara, and he shacks up with Vela and they become birds together. It's not a marriage, but no one ever says anything about them being together when she doesn't have power and he does. It only seems to be a problem when Dernick, the man, has less power than Polgara, the woman. Alright, let's shelve Polgara for the time being and move on to how David sexualizes children. Ugh. I could talk about how Sinedra, who, if you'll recall, is 15 throughout most of the series, gets naked quite a bit, but at the very least, David, unlike George, doesn't go into loving detail describing a literal child's naked body, so I don't think that's really the issue here. The Dryads are way weirder. So the Dryads are a race of women who live in a big forest, talk to their big trees, and lure men in to have sex with them. He's a deeply horny man, David Eddings. Dryads live for several hundred years, but they're all very small and look like children.
Officer, I swear to God, she's a 1,000-year-old vampire. She only looks like she's 15.
So we're already in some very weird territory. That's some real anime shit. It gets even weirder in chapter 28 of Belgarath the Sorcerer, where the man himself goes to the forest of the Dryads and feeds one of them some chocolate. Apparently, dear viewer, and believe me, I hate saying this sentence out loud, apparently, when you feed chocolate to Dryads, they go into
orgasmic ecstasy. He feeds some to some other dryads, and the same thing happens. So, they're not literal, actual children, I know that, but their sexualization is still very bizarre and reads quite creepily in the moment. But what about actual children? In The Redemption of Althalos, there's a character called Undine. She's the Arya of a place called Ostos, so she's basically a queen. She's 15. She's stated to be 15, and in general very young many times throughout the book, and yet we still get a bunch of descriptions of her beauty from much older men and from the narration itself. But they do always make sure to mention how annoying and shrill-voiced she can be, just to temper the compliments. Her voice was rich and vibrant, the kind of voice that stirs a man's spirit. Your Arya's a beautiful young woman, Lord Darkhan, Althalos observed. That's the only reason we tolerate her, Althalos. She's pretty enough that we can overlook her flaws. Even when she'd been scowling at Eliar, she'd been beautiful. But when she smiled, her beauty made Althalos go weak at the knees. Dude, she's 15. 15! You're like 2000 and you're already in love with a cat goddess in the house at the end of the world. God, this book is weird. And creepy. That's creepy, right? Like, I'm not imagining it. It's weird character-wise to have Althalos say this 15-year-old girl is so beautiful it makes his knees weak, but it's creepy to have the narration mention that she's super sexy, right? Anyway, let's move on, because there's a lot more to cover in this book. Seriously, he goes like full mask off in Redemption of Althalos. I'm not sure whether he just got lazier or whether he actually became a shittier person. So a big part of the plot of this book is about this magical knife. In the Gathering the Team section of the story, Althalos goes around to the various kingdoms that Dave has shamelessly stolen from his previous works and shows them each this knife. There's a word they have to read on it. The word changes from person to person, so Althalos gets seek, Elia, the young soldier, gets lead, Bade, the priest, gets illuminate, and Ger, the little thief boy, gets deceive. Now it's time for the ladies. We've discussed Undine already. She's basically a spoiled little princess. Now, the other woman on the team who isn't Emmy/Dwyer, the immortal sexy cat goddess, is Latha. She can read minds, and she's also super sexy because of course she is. Those are legitimately most of her character traits. When Undine reads the knife, she sees the word obey. Way less cool than lead or deceive, but it's supposed to be a play on how she's always giving orders, so now she has to obey them, I guess. That's shit. That's a super passive and lame objective to give one of your two mortal female characters. So what about Latha? Well, since she has mind-reading powers, she gets listen. So I get the idea. It's played off as being about her powers. She has to listen to the right thoughts to help them win. But couldn't she have got the word scout? Or spy? Or sabotage? Or subterfuge? Infiltrate? Literally anything cooler and less stereotypically sexist and passive than fucking listen. And Undine, why couldn't she have deceive? Because that's what she ultimately does. Or bait and switch. Hyphenated, obviously. Maybe if one of them got a cool word, I wouldn't be bringing it up in this video, but they get obey and listen, and it really feels like David's trying to tell us something. All of the men get super active tasks. Lead, seek, deceive, illuminate. Those are things you have to go out and do. But obey and listen, those are things that happen to you. You know what? I take back when I just said that I might not include it in this video if one of them got a good word, because it really wouldn't change the nature of their tasks, would it? And while we're on the topic of this particular book, Latha starts calling Althalos daddy about halfway through, and it's really jarring and I hate it. Dave's also at his worst, not only with the horniness, but with the idea that every woman on the good side is beautiful and gorgeous, and Gelta, the only woman on the evil side, is as big as any man and far more savage. She's a homely woman with a pockmarked face and a big nose. She's also truly ugly. Her face was a mass of deeply indented pockmarks. She has a big nose that's obviously been broken several times. She has pig-like eyes, more than a hint of a mustache, shoulders like an ox, and a rancid fragrance about her. Jesus Christ, we get it already. Seriously, this is the only evil woman, and she's described like this. Anyway, that's enough about Althalos. Let's move on to the big one. Now, I know it's fictional, but I am going to talk about abuse and marital rape in this section, so if that's not your cup of tea, then I'll put a timestamp on the screen that you can skip to, and I'll see you in the next section. So Barak is part of the fellowship that journeys with Garyon throughout the entire first series. He's a Kerek warrior, so basically he's a big Viking man that occasionally turns into a bear when Garyon's in danger. He is the personal protector of our main character. Fortunately, I'm sure you can see where I'm going with this from my warning earlier. Barak has a wife, Meryl, and 2 daughters. It was an arranged marriage, and Meryl wasn't keen on it. In fact, the first time we see them both together on the page, you can tell that their relationship is very strange. Meryl is always calling Barak out in public, nagging him, giving him the cold shoulder. But why? My lord was quite insistent about certain rights and duties on the night of his return to Val Alorn, she said. Not even the locked door of my bedchamber was enough to curb his insistence. There's no 2 ways about this. This is rape. He rapes her. This act is grievously overused in the fantasy genre, but at the very least it is usually portrayed as the horrific act that it is. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said here. Even in the moment of bringing it up, Barak sweeps it under the rug with a lame apology, and Meryl is cast as unnecessarily cruel and degrading to her husband. Clearly, a much larger crime. Then, it's never brought up again. I feel it's important to draw attention to the fact that this happens in the first book. This isn't some horrible revelation that you get down the line, which makes you question your admiration for this character. No, this is one of the first things we learn about Barak. So what happens then? Do any of our other main heroes call out this awful man for his abuse and assault? Do any of them pursue the matter further and perhaps take steps to ensure that Meryl is safe and alright and prevent this from happening again? Does our young protagonist learn any important lessons from this disturbing exchange? I'm sure you know the answer already. None of those things happen. Meryl continues to be portrayed as unsympathetic, and Barak is treated as a hero by both the characters in the story and the story itself. Now, if you want to argue that marital rape was common in this nebulous, medieval-ish time period that the books were set in, go for it. If you want to argue that marital rape was probably still common when these books were written, go for it. Neither of those points invalidate the fact that this is a terrible thing to include in a series aimed at young readers, and is unequivocally suggesting that Barak did nothing wrong. Need more proof as to why this little bit of backstory is awful and misogynistic? Later in the piece, in the 4th book of the Belgariad, Barak and Meryl have a son as a result of this marital rape. When Barak learns that this kid is a boy, he starts treating Meryl better, and she even starts to love him. Barak's wife had drawn herself up with pride. "I have done well then, my lord?" Eddings even implies that this son fixed their marriage. Then, a little bit later than that, Meryl seems to show great remorse for the way she's treated Barak, coming to Polgara and pouring her heart out for the man she loves. "Oh, Polgara," Meryl said with a helpless little laugh. "He looks so much like a great shaggy bear, but he's so gentle inside. Why couldn't I have seen that before? All those years wasted." "You had to grow up, Meryl," Aunt Pol told her. "It takes some people longer, that's all." So there you have it. Basically, all Meryl had to do to fix their marriage was grow up, learn to stop questioning her husband, and stop complaining about being raped. It takes some people longer, that's all. This is awful. It was already bad when Barak faced no repercussions, but flipping it back on Meryl and implying that she was the problem with their relationship is inexcusable. I don't care what time period Dave came from, the 1980s or the 1480s. This is disgusting. Also, he's so gentle inside, why couldn't I have seen that earlier? It was probably because of the rape, Meryl. Let's not lose sight of that. When their marriage is going through this healing process, Barak never gets offered a similar chance at redemption, so to speak. He never goes through any remorseful, apologetic transformation. He never talks to the other characters about how sorry he feels for treating Meryl the way he did. He never even brings up his past transgressions. The only time this event is ever brought up is in the first book, where Barak makes one singular apology and then drops the matter forever. If that's not sexist writing, I don't know what is, but let me hammer it home with one final example. In the second book of the Belgariad, Queen of Sorcery, Garion is kidnapped in Nyissa, the land of the snake people, and he's taken to their queen, Salmisra. Now, he's about 15 here. Salmisra drugs him and tries to rape him. She isn't successful because, holy shit, that would be an insane thing to put in these books, and also the prophecy in Garion's head prevents the drugs from working. But when Polgara finds out that Salmisra has attempted this, she turns her into a snake. Everyone is in agreement that this was a terrible thing for Salmisra to have attempted, and that she has been rightly punished. I'm not suggesting that this perception of Salmisra as compared to Barak is because she's a woman and it's therefore worse. I understand that marital rape wasn't seen as a crime on par with what Salmisra tried to pull, but it's pretty cut and dry in terms of the consequences. Barak is a hero who gets to journey with our main protagonists and receive all the benefits of being part of a team, and none of the setbacks of having raped his wife. Salmisra is a snake. Forever. I've just looked at my notes and I've written Salmisra is a pedophile, but that's neither here nor there. Actually, I think that is fairly relevant, Josh. So David Eddings is not great at writing women. He objectifies and sexualizes almost every female character, treats many of them as passive instruments of the story, rarely gives them as much agency as his male characters, and mishandles Polgara, the only character close to hitting the mark, so badly that she often comes across as unsympathetic and antithetical to her supposed values. He constantly pairs up middle-aged men with women in their teens or 20s. In fact, he often puts very young girls in his stories for the express purpose of marrying them off to older men, and it's incredibly obvious every time he does so. As I said at the start of this chapter, it's not uncommon for male authors to write this way, or even to write worse. Perhaps he's just a product of his time. Perhaps he's never met a real human woman before. We may never know. Only he'd had a partner to help him write these female characters, to help him do them justice. Someone with experience interacting with women, or even being a woman. A woman, maybe. It's twist time, baby, because guess what? He did! As he tells us in the foreword of Belgarath the Sorcerer, his wife Lee had been co-author on some of his books. Wait, no. All of them. Literally, all of them except for the very first book he wrote. She co-wrote all of the Belgariad, all of the Malorian, both the standalone sequels, and the Redemption of Althalas. She was there, writing them with him the entire time. All along, you thought it was just Dave being a shitbag misogynist, not really realizing that women are actually people too. But it was actually both of them. So, obviously this begs the question, what the fuck? Lee, how did this happen? How did you let your husband botch it so badly? There's only really one explanation for this. She's a shitbag misogynist too. Or, at the very least, she writes like one. I'm not going to play armchair psychologist and draw conclusions about a dead couple's marriage based on the fantasy books they wrote together, but I would have loved to see what their dynamic was really like. I think we might get a little glimpse into what their everyday conversations might look like a little later in this video though. So there you have it. I promise I'm done with the big twists now. You can continue watching the video knowing that what you see is what you get. With that being said, let's move on to our next chapter.
Ancient prophecies and wise, all-knowing seers are steadfast staples of fantasy literature. Given that Dave and Lee have admitted that they basically crammed every trope possible into the Belgariad, it's no surprise that this one made the cut. Usually when a prophecy shows up, it's to herald the coming of a main character, or a great evil. Think Macbeth, Lord of the Rings, A Song of Ice and Fire. Sometimes prophecies can be misinterpreted, or used as a device for a character to rage against their destiny, like Harry Potter, which is also a self-fulfilling prophecy. There are abstract prophetic dreams, soothsayers who get details wrong, people who desperately strive and struggle to fulfill destinies only to realize they weren't even the ones referenced. There are so many different ways that you can incorporate this into a story, but I think old Davy Boy has chosen the single most boring and dry method possible. Prophecy in the world of the Belgariad works by way of two divergent possibilities. Naturally, these are good and evil, and they're working against each other in the lead up to one big final confrontation at the end of the Malorian to decide how the universe will continue. They choose certain events to have their little fights, each time picking an agent, a child of light and a child of dark. Now, this might make for an interesting dynamic if they weren't allowed to constantly interfere, taking control of characters' actions and arranging certain events, conversations, and even entire relationships just to get to their desired outcome. Garion often hears the voice of the good possibility in his mind, giving him advice and instruction, but sometimes it just prevents him from taking certain actions at all. Why choose Garion as the child of light if you're not going to give him any agency in the events? Why not just do it yourself? This makes characters do and say certain things, not because it's within character for those things to happen, but because the prophecy has decided that it's about time. Why are you doing this? He demanded of her in an almost tragic voice. Why must you forever follow me and mock me with your eyes? I don't really know, she replied, sounding almost puzzled. You're not really that attractive. This is Tiber, a Marag woman and former slave, tormenting Relg, an Ulgo religious fanatic with sexual tension and unwanted touch. She does it all the time, but she doesn't even know why. I mean, her character, such that it is probably malleable enough that you could say that she just really has some deep-seated need to pester Relg like this. He is a shit bloke. The reader knows exactly why it's happening though. From the first second they interact, it's obvious. Dave needs them to get together. Dave needs them to have a bunch of babies. So, instead of giving them actual chemistry, he just goes, the prophecy will take care of it all. That's good enough. A better example of this comes in chapter 31 of Belgarath the Sorcerer. The Asturian Arrans are attacking Vowakoon, or Vowasoon, or however you pronounce it. It's the seat of power for the Wassite Arrans. You haven't heard me mention them before because they get wiped off the face of the earth. Polgara is currently living in Vowasoon as the Duchess of a nearby duchy, and she loves the Wassites. Belgarath swoops in and tells her that she has to get out of here or she's gonna die. Naturally, she rejects this idea, says she wants to stay, help drive off the Asturians. What does Belgarath say? Well, here's the exchange. I'm not going anywhere. Now that you're here, we can drive off the Asturians. No, as a matter of fact, we can't. It's prohibited. I'm sorry, Pol, but this has to happen, and we're not allowed to interfere. There's a lot to unpack here. First of all, this is something that has to happen. It was preordained, and nothing they do can stop it. That's lame and lazy, and it makes much of the storyline seem pointless. It robs the tragic fall of the Wassite Arrans of a lot of emotional weight. This was always going to happen. Secondly, Belgarath says we can't. It's prohibited. Not only are they not able to do anything about it, they're not even allowed to try. This is the most boring way you could possibly explain a prophecy like this one. Vowasoon is doomed, but our main characters don't like that, so they try to stop it, but they don't succeed. So they try something else, but that doesn't work either. Eventually, they realize that all of their efforts have been in vain, or perhaps have even contributed to the downfall of Vowasoon, fulfilling the prophecy. I know it's cliche, but at least this way, something happens. It's way less interesting to just have them leave because some cosmic douchebag decided that they're not even allowed to try to stop his little battle from going the way it's supposed to go. Surely, if this was something that the prophecy decides has to happen anyway, Belgarath and Polgara couldn't stop it if they tried, but I guess we'll never know. No agency for you.
In addition to this robbing of character agency, Dave often describes things as having been predetermined by fate, robbing the narrative of some much-needed tension. as had been ordained from the beginning of time. It's quite possible that insulting you at that particular moment was the only reason he was born in the first place. The prophecy leaves nothing to chance. What's happening is supposed to happen. One particularly frustrating event is when Belgarath steals the Orb of Aldur back from Torak. He takes Kerek Bareshoulders, Draz Bullneck, Algar Fleetfoot, and Reaver Irongrip over to Meloria. They sneak into Cathol Mishrak, the city of night, where Torak is waiting. Wait, no, he's just asleep in the next room. I'm not kidding. As the maimed god twisted and turned in his pain-haunted slumber, that burning eye seemed to follow us, watching, even though Torak himself was powerless to prevent what we were going to do. So Torak, the dragon god of Angarak, the guy who cracked the world, the child of dark, is forced to take a power nap while Belgarath and his bros nick the orb? He can't do anything. Why? He wakes up right after they're gone anyway, chasing them and forcing Reaver to use the orb and kill a bunch of people. Why couldn't he just do something earlier? Why couldn't he have tried to stop them? Why did the possibility not let him interfere? Well, obviously it's because David Eddings wanted him to be there, and even if he didn't know how to write him not being there. But he also didn't know how to write the scene without Torak interfering, so he just put him to sleep. It's lazy, but it also tanks the tension. We already know they're going to succeed because we've heard stories about this event from earlier in the books, so that's not a great start, but this just makes it feel like a big joke. Yeah, what an ordeal that was, stealing the rock from a coma patient. It happens again with Torak in the same book when Polgara is spying on him. Torak can probably hear you, Pol. He can't hear a thing. It's all taken care of. He can't see me, and he can't hear me. Well, thank God the all-powerful possibility took care of that one, Paul. I was afraid something interesting was going to happen. Okay, maybe I'm being a little unfair with this one, because in Polgara the Sorceress, you do find out that the reason Torak can't hear her or see her is because she's fused with her mother's spirit in the body of an owl. But the only reason that happens is because the possibility told Poledra, her mother, to do that, so it amounts to the same thing anyway. It feels like a get-out-of-jail-free card. Every time Davy and Lee want something to happen, but they're not quite sure how to get there, they just slap a prophecy in and say the possibility made it happen. If they're going to interfere so much to make certain events go certain ways, why even have any events leading up to the big one? What's the point? If everything's been decided ahead of time, then why should we care? No matter what our characters do, it's going to turn out a certain way, so where's the tension? It gets quite frustrating after a while, especially when you start to see it coming. The redemption of Althalis isn't immune to this either. It doesn't have any set prophecies per se, but Deimos, who is basically the god of everything, has a big plan in his head of how everything's supposed to go, and everything pretty much just goes according to that. Why did he let them die out then? Because they'd done everything they were supposed to do. They'd completed what they'd been put here to attend to, so Deimos let them go. It's the same sort of thing as Voakun. Something was preordained to happen, it happened as preordained, then whatever. It just doesn't make for very interesting storytelling in my opinion. Dwyer does a similar thing at the start of the book too, forcing Althalis into a string of bad luck, forcing him to take a particular job, forcing him to come to the end of the world and kick off the events of the story. In fact, it happens at many other points throughout the story too. Dwyer knows something has to happen at a certain place at a certain time, so she acts just like the possibilities in the Belgariad and just tells Althalis what to do. This isn't my biggest complaint against David and Lee, but it's disappointing to have to make it at all. So much effort goes into crafting believable worlds and characters and stories, and it really feels like they just cut corners to hit the plot beats they wanted to hit. Lazy. While we're on the theme of laziness, let's get to our next chapter. T.S. Eliot says that good writers borrow and great writers steal. Well, Dave and Lee must be fucking fantastic then, because they are not afraid of thievery. I'm not talking about how much they stole from Tolkien, I'm talking about the dragon-sized hoard that they stole from themselves. So we already know that the kingdoms of the Belgariad are shamelessly stolen from real-life history. But everyone does that. What not everyone does is take these kingdoms and just reuse them later for other books. The Alorns are Vikings, but they're also Arams in Redemption of Althalas. Tolnedra is Rome, but it's also Treberia in Redemption of Althalas. The Angarax are a big, weird mashup of whatever David Eddings felt like at the time, and they're also Nequeros from Redemption of Althalas. He was very eco-friendly with all of this recycling. In fact, he recycles a bunch of stuff for this book. Fellowship of the Knife is just the Fellowship of the Orb, and again they have to go trekking across all of the good side kingdoms to collect all of their MacGuffins and heroes. But at least this time, the bad people are in the West. So, it's a nice change, isn't it? Okay, so he reuses some political structures and societal archetypes for the kingdoms. I don't really care about that. That's not why I included it in this chapter. The real problem comes from reusing characters and dialogue. You start to notice a very distinct pattern, just like I was talking about before. Althalas is Silk, Lather is Tiber, Bade is Relg, Undine is Sinedra, Emmy is Polgara. You'll have to take my word for some of them, because I can't go into detail for all of them, I simply don't have time. But you'll see what I mean. Sinedra and Undine are both members of the monarchy of their homelands. They're both 15 years old, they're both small and pretty, with shrill voices that seem to rise several octaves when they get mad. They're both from the Rome equivalents in their stories, they both lose their fathers, they both start out bossy and overbearing, but end up as good little wives. That one's lazy, but it's not even the most overt example. The big one is Emmy and Polgara. Polgara is a pale, dark-haired beauty with great magical power, who is thousands of years old but still looks young, and marries a man far younger than she. Emmy is a pale beauty with great magical power, who is thousands of years old but still looks young, and marries a man far younger than she. The only difference in these superficial characteristics is that she has autumn hair. Now you might think that these similarities are coincidental, or as I just said, superficial, but I assure you it goes much deeper than that. Before I get into that, however, I have a few more comparisons to make. In the Diamond Throne, there's a character called Sophrenia. She just happens to be a pale, dark-haired beauty with great magical power, who is several thousand years old but still looks young. I don't know about the marriage part, but she's Polgara. Then there's Zelana from the Elder Gods, who is a pale, dark-haired beauty with great magical power, who still looks... She's Polgara. Dave and Lee made one nearly good female character, and just copy-pasted her into every story they ever wrote. Both Emmy and Polgara speak in this constant, annoying, sarcastic way, always making snarky comments and being really condescending to everyone around them. Every conversation one of them has with their respective love interest or protagonist can be neatly exchanged for another, because every word each of them says is exactly what the other one would say. In fact, sometimes they do use the exact same verbiage. You'll see the phrase, "that'll do," about 1,000 times throughout these books. "That'll do, love," "that'll do, Althalas," "that'll do, Garion." They also both throw "never mind" around constantly. One character will be saying or doing something snarky, or perhaps pursuing a thread of information that they're not ready to bring up. Then Emmy or Polgara will say "never mind" and shut it down. This problem actually goes beyond Emmy and Polgara, but those two are the most alike, and therefore the most easily analogous pair. Seriously, they are borderline identical in mannerisms and speech patterns. Speech patterns get reused for everyone though. That "never mind" thing I was talking about before? Everyone does it. Althalas does it. Belgarath does it. Silk does it. Hell, even Garion does it. That's more than just a common phrase at this point. So they all use a similar vernacular when they're annoyed or trying to shut something down. So what? Oh, my sweet summer child, if only it ended there. There are so many phrases that get repeated by almost every single character. If you've ever read any David Eddings, then just have a listen to this list and tell me if it sounds familiar. You're enjoying this, aren't you? When you get right down to it, it's not really all that complicated. Isn't he a nice boy? Are you making fun of me? Would I do that? It does sort of fit. Old boy. Yes, dear. I know it sounds weird out of context, but when you read these books, you can't help but notice these phrases crop up over and over and over again. If just one character stuck to their own phrases, it would get annoying, but I would understand it. The fact that all of these characters come out with all of these phrases all the time just makes them all meld together. None of them have their own individual voice. They all speak with this same sardonic humour. Dave loves that adjective too. Everything is sardonic to him. I'm not just referring to the Belgariad and Althalis either. Even the few chapters of the Elder Gods and the Diamond Throne that I read were riddled with this stuff as well. It also goes beyond contained sayings and phrases. Entire conversations will play out in identical ways, and sometimes it doesn't even matter which characters are involved. It's kind of hard to really get this point across properly without just quoting a bunch of dialogue from the books, but if you've read them, then you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Plenty of other people have noticed and pointed out this phenomenon online as well, so if you just look up some reviews of David Eddings' books, then you'll probably get a good idea of what I'm talking about. Everyone mocks each other. Silk is the worst offender in the Belgariad, but if you skip over to Althalis, then everyone just does it all the time. It's genuinely exhausting to read. There's only so many times I can hear somebody call Silk a very bad man or hear something said mockingly before my eyes glaze over and my brain turns soft. While we're on the topic of dialogue, there's something else that old Davey repeats too. I know other writers also do this, but this video isn't about other writers, is it? Stop bringing them up. When he's introducing two random characters, he always has them say each other's names in the very first sentence of their dialogue. Now, I get it. It's kind of awkward to keep referring to them by their descriptions or just chuck a name in the dialogue tags off the cuff, but it still sounds quite stilted. "It's absolutely ridiculous, Rissus," one shaved-headed eunuch was saying to his companion. "Can't she even read?" He spoke in a rich contralto voice. "I'm sure she can, Salus," Rissus replied. No one really talks like this. Again, I understand why it's here and why it plays out the way it does, but there has to be a better way to do this. Let's move on to a far more egregious example. "The report I have for His Majesty is so vital that I decided to carry it myself." What could be so earth-shaking that it would drag the chief of the Bureau of Internal Affairs away from the comforts of Malzeth? Really?
Well, had some important documents to give to the boss. Didn't want to just send a fax, you know?
Wow, what's so important that it would take James Jonathan Smith, the newly promoted assistant manager of marketing and communications, a young white man with short build and light brown hair, away from his comfy home at 22 Allegory Place in West Pine Hills where...
Dude, you wearing a fucking wire or something?
That's what it feels like. That dialogue I quoted just before was so ham-fisted that it inspired this entire little sketch and may have permanently reduced my ability to enjoy life itself. So yeah, that's what the character introductions sound like, and it may seem tame in this video, but I promise it's kind of brutal when you read it several times per book. So we've established that they repeat dialogue phrases and patterns so often that characters lose their distinctive voices. And we know that they have a problem introducing new characters because they use that same shitty technique every time. Well, they repeat something else as well. The story. So I mentioned it before with the redemption of Althalis, but you don't even have to go that far out. The Belgariad and the Malorian are two sides of the same coin. They play out in shamelessly similar ways, from collecting disparate prophesied companions, to a new dark prophecy that everyone's working to avoid, to the final showdown between the Child of Light and the Child of Dark at a special location. They may go to different places with different characters, but the plot beats all feel pretty much the same, and even some specific events are repeated. But don't take my word for it. The characters within the story notice this too. "Why does it seem that we've done this before?" he asked. "It's the same as last time. Do you remember that old gold hunter we met in Garog Nadrak when the three of us were on our way to Cathol Mishrak?" Silk nodded a bit dubiously. "Wasn't the old fellow we just talked with almost exactly the same?" So even the characters know that things are happening in the same way as the first series. In universe, the explanation is that there's always a lead up to a big event where the two possibilities meet. Convenient. So, outside of this fantasy world, we the readers can understand that this is happening because they've already copied too many broad strokes, so why the fuck not just throw in some examples where literally the exact same thing happens? So, that's dumb, but also, what are you doing? Don't lampshade this is bad. Drawing attention to it doesn't make it better, it just means that the stuff you haven't drawn attention to is more likely to get noticed now.
I get that it's meant to all make sense in universe, but God, it feels so lazy. Maybe that should have been the title of this chapter. Laziness. So much of this repetition is because they couldn't be bothered to write proper dialogue or to differentiate their characters or design an original story. It really yanks that elusive immersion away from you when you start noticing these things, and especially when the writers hang a fucking neon flashing lampshade on it. Also, it's a small point, but all of his prologues are the same. They all start with the same high style these and thous, and they cover roughly the same stuff. Then again, the previous section probably could have been called laziness too, and funnily enough, so can the next one.
World building is tough, especially for high fantasy. I've written several fantasy books myself and am writing another one now, so I understand how much time you can really sink into creating worlds like this from scratch. Mine are probably shit, but you can't have it all. My point is, it's a painstaking process, getting all the pieces into the right place, making sure they fit together properly, making sure that the world is coherent and immersive. We already know that Davey cut a few corners with his real-world insertions. He doesn't have to come up with a whole system of government, economics, military, society for Tolnedra. He already has the Roman Empire. They have emperors, they have different dynastic families, they have legions, they have roads. The Tolnedrans are so Roman, they use Roman numerals. This is my first example for this chapter. Something that's so blatantly phoned in that it makes the world feel fake. It's like watching a movie with really bad CGI where you can just tell that the actors are standing in front of blue and green sheets. It's the literary equivalent of the Star Wars prequels. Unfortunately, because these kingdoms and countries are so haphazardly thrown together, like a child making macaroni art from across the room, there's some collateral damage. I mentioned in the first chapter that each race has a stereotype which is both universal and immutable. Well, in addition to the racist overtones, this has some pretty important consequences for the world building and character creation within this world. It's almost like Dave and Lee set themselves a challenge. How far can we stretch the rigid premise of this culture without straying a single bee's dick width from the archetypes that we created? Because God forbid any of our characters be distinct from one another. Every time you meet a citizen of a certain kingdom, you can make a bunch of assumptions about them that are guaranteed to be correct. No doubt this technique, if we can call it that, was used to make sure that readers always know where we are in the world at any given point in time. But the unintended side effect is that it makes the world he's built seem tiny. It reduces vast kingdoms and societies to very small groups, all with minute variations on a central theme. David also uses this technique to condense huge exposition dumps into just a few lines to explain away an entire people and their culture, which is very efficient, but also very shallow. It leads to this strange phenomenon though, where in order to explain why certain people are acting in certain ways, instead of just trusting that the reader has gone through the previous material to get to this point, characters will start talking about their own cultures in this one-dimensional fashion, reducing themselves to caricatures. Tolnedrans do not believe in sorcery. I am a Tolnedran, therefore I do not admit that it exists. The Tolnedrans don't believe in sorcery, so even if they see it with their own eyes, they still won't admit that that's what they've seen. This isn't a character coming up with another rational explanation for what's going on here that doesn't involve sorcery. This is just them saying that Tolnedrans can't believe in it, so I can't believe in it, because I'm a Tolnedran. One blanket statement to cover an entire race of people. As he walked along behind Aunt Pole, Garion noticed with a certain distaste that the Nyissans wore elaborate makeup on their eyes, and that their lips and cheeks were rouged. Their speech was rasping and sibilant, and they all seemed to affect a lisp. We connive and plot and scheme against each other, and every scrap of food prepared in our kitchens is tainted with poison. The queens of Nyissa are always named Salmistra, that's all. Do you know this particular one? I don't have to, she told him. They're always exactly the same. They all look alike and act alike. If you know one, you know them all. Ah, okay, Nyissa sounds terrible. How does anyone stay alive long enough to get anything done? Also, even more lampshading for reusing characters. This time, they're all supposed to look and act the exact same way. Dave takes this one step further. People don't just know what stereotypes they fit into. They don't just know what everyone else in their kingdom thinks and feels. They also happen to know all of the social and political situations happening in nearby towns, cities, courts, and even inside the nobles' minds. Seriously, it happens all the time. The Fellowship rolls up to the outskirts of a city and then stumbles upon a random farmer or peasant. They ask the farmer what's going on, and then the farmer gives them a perfectly accurate and perfectly detailed description of everything that's going on with the city's ruler and their policies and how the people are responding to said issues. It happens a lot in Althalis too, because the heroes show up, but then they actually get told how to handle certain situations, like play by play, and it's never wrong. Wow, these are some really politically and socially well-connected farmers. Or David can't be bothered doling out exposition in a measured, natural way. I'll let you decide. There's another, more sinister side effect to all of this as well. When you create a perfect little kingdom where everyone's too stupid for scheming or too practical for subterfuge, what then? Do you create a character that goes against the grain? Do you dare break your own rules and admit that your ideas might have been a little too firm? No, obviously. You have the perfect solution already lying in wait to the east. Why make the good guys in the west do any bad things when you can just have those filthy, disgusting Angaraks do all the dirty work for them? Let me give you an example. In Queen of Sorcery, the second book in the series, there's a squabble happening in Erendia. It's a stupid fight between two minor nobles, and even they don't seem to fully remember why it started in the first place. Our heroes, however, deduced that the Murgos were behind it all along. It wasn't your fault, he informed the Baron. Your war was the Murgos' doing. He twisted your minds and set you on each other. So even for a small conflict like this, the Murgos have to be behind it, pulling the strings. They're so evil and crafty, and the Westerners are far too noble to ever pull something like this by themselves. I know that's not exactly what's going on here, but that's what it feels like. I don't need to be reminded every 2 seconds how awful the Murgos are. I get the picture. In the same book, a few hundred pages later, we see a particular character, Kador. He's Tolnedran, and he's a dick. He's power hungry and he wants the Imperial throne. Why does he want these things? Because Asherak the Murgo has manipulated him into wanting them, of course. He can't just want them for himself, but why? We've seen other Tolnedran characters be power hungry too, so why can't this just be something that he wants for himself? It's because he kidnaps the heroes, isn't it? He's allowed to be a dick, but he's not allowed to do bad things unless there's a Murgo involved. How titillating. There's more to world building than just background stuff though. How do our characters fit into the world? How does the world react to their actions? How does it change and shape them along their journey? Let's take a look at our main character, Garion. He's a simple farm boy who grows up to be King of Riva and Overlord of the West. It's a great prophetic tale when you put it like that. He comes from nothing and gets to be the most powerful person in the world. Pretty cool, right? He has like 4 entire books to get to being king, so I wonder what skills he learns along the way to help him rule this place he's never been and these people he's never met. Maybe he learns statecraft from some wise mentors. Perhaps he learns a lot of history. Or maybe he learns the fine arts of diplomacy, negotiation, and critical thinking. No way, that sounds boring as fuck. He learns how to fight with a sword, how to use magic, and how to fight off the unwanted advances of other girls. Way cooler. Way better for being a king, obviously. Okay, so he does eventually learn how to read and write, but it takes a while and he's already 15. Why? He was always going to be the king, the chosen one. So why not teach him to be a good king from the start? Well, Polgara has a convenient explanation for that as well. Garion's not like the others. He's going to be the child of light, if he isn't already. And I don't want to clutter his mind with cabinetry, tombstones, or shoemaking. I want him to have a good mind, but one that's uncluttered and undeveloped. So obviously, this is a retcon. Dave and Lee realised that throughout the entirety of the Belgariad, they hadn't given Garion any skills that would actually make him a good ruler, so they put this little bit in about this being intentional. It's more lampshading. Honestly, I just should have made a chapter about lampshading. This isn't the full scope of her plan either. She doesn't teach him to read on purpose. She doesn't teach him about the world on purpose. She doesn't tell him about Riva, or take him to Riva, or let him meet any Rivans on purpose. Unfortunately, it doesn't make sense, and it has disastrous implications for the world. Specifically, Riva. In Castle of Wizardry, Garion and the others show up at Riva just in time to learn that he is the long-lost king, and he gets to be the one to fondle the orb without dying. That's all good and well, and when he gets crowned, basically on the spot, it's made clear that at the very least, he has the previous ruler, Brand, to help him out at the start. Brand is cool with it, because his ancestors have always known that the Rivan king would return. But no one else knows that. To everyone else on Riva, some Sandarian kid just turned up, put on a crown, and started ordering them around. Let me be clear. This is Garion's first ever visit to Riva. He knows shit all about their country, their culture, their government, their economics, their policies, and now he's the fucking king. Except he's not just the king, he's also the overlord of the West, so he has a huge amount of influence in the other Alon kingdoms, Keric, Drasnia, and Algaria. Okay, this is super fucked up. Surely anyone else you pluck off the streets of Riva is going to be better at ruling than this dipshit who only learned how to read like 2 months ago. So, how do the Rivan people respond to such a huge insult to their governance? Well, if you guessed anything, you're wrong. They don't respond at all. This is just something that happens, that everyone is cool with and no one questions. There's not even like a transitionary period where he gets taught how to rule beforehand. They just tell him to do it. And then, a few weeks later, he runs off to kill Torak without telling anyone. The only person in Riva who reacts negatively to this development is Bran's son, who makes one weak-as-piss attempt to assassinate Garion, then becomes loyal to him. Wow, Riva must be the most tolerant and open-minded kingdom in the history of fantasy kingdoms to just allow this random immigrant child to come in and become their ruler without any pushback. Except that they're not, because all Alorns are super racist towards Angarax, and possibly Nyasans, and also possibly Tolnedrons. At some point between the Belgariad and the Malorian, I guess David and Lee must have realised this, because there are 2 lines in Guardians of the West that kind of try and hand-wave Garion's inexperience away. Fortunately, the Isle of Winds was not a difficult kingdom to rule. The Rivan people were orderly, sober, and had a strong regard for duty and civic responsibility. This had made things much easier for their tall, sandy-haired monarch during the trying, early years of his reign while he was learning the difficult art of ruling well. Okay, so he did have this adjustment period where he wasn't great at ruling and he needed to learn how. Why would Belgarath and Polgara not teach him, I don't know, anything to make that easier? They had 5 books in which to do this, but what, he was safer as a secret, but also all the bad guys kind of knew who he was anyway? I get that it's aimed for a YA audience. I get that it doesn't have to be the most politically complex or realistic series to be enjoyable and entertaining. My point is that this little tidbit of world building makes these characters who are supposed to be really wise seem utterly moronic, and it makes Rivan commoners and the wider society seem non-existent. The frustration with Garion's ability to rule and his role in the world continues in the Malorian. In Book 3, Chapter 1, Silk is trying to give Garion some information about the Malorian Emperor, his political advisors, and his political adversaries. Then we get this absolute banger about the King of Riva, the Overlord of the West. Garion was not really that curious about the intricacies of Malorian politics, so he let the matter drop, to return to the subject they had been discussing previously. Bro, you are the king. The Emperor of Maloria is the most dangerous person in the world apart from you, and you don't care? Listen, Davey, Lazy, I know you're like super dead right now, but can you come up with an explanation for why you didn't include more in-depth world building that's like 1 microscopic iota more believable and less infuriating than this? Just have someone interrupt them. Belgarath is in the room. Just have him clear his throat or something. Anything. So there's only one more thing that I want to bring up before we move on, and that's Deus Ex Machina. often our characters will get themselves into situations with a little bit of tension.
That's writing, baby.
What's totally not writing, baby, is how D&L get them out of these situations. The techniques are always the same. Is there someone who needs to be incapacitated quietly, killed surreptitiously, or questioned quickly? Well, just get Sadi, the Niacin, to open his magical drug case and pull out exactly what you need. We know he has every drug imaginable because he's Niacin, and all Niacins have complete knowledge of and use all drugs. Sadi's like a walking literary apothecary by the end of the Malorian, with how often he goes into his little case and withdraws a herb-related plot contrivance. The laziness actually goes further than this, though, because in addition to Sadi's Niacin-ness meaning that he always has the right drug for every occasion, all of the people they interrogate seem to have the full, correct, and accurate answers that the heroes need. This also happens in a similar way with the Drasnians. They have an intelligence service and a little secret sign language. This is fine, and also good, but it means that Lave and D can give the heroes any information at all, whenever they want, just as long as they slip in a few lines about how Silk, a Drasnian, went for a little evening stroll earlier, or how Belgarath happened to bump into another member of the Drasnian Secret Service. Secret Service? That's not what I meant. Intelligence Service. I could edit that out, but I think I'm just going to leave that in. These excuses are doubly easy to pull off because the story makes it clear that these guys are literally everywhere. Nothing happens without the Drasnians knowing. Therefore, no information is unknowable, which robs the story of a lot of intrigue. It also means that every time these guys show up and dole out the exact right info, it's very boring and very predictable. Given that these two occurrences are technically telegraphed by the one-line world building that David and Lee have done for these two kingdoms, it might not actually qualify for Deus Ex Machina. But it's still cheap and lazy, and it stems from the shallow world that they've created. It's strange because I know they're capable of doing good world building, of including these unique elements. Just look at Meloria, Delasia, Melsina, there's some good stuff there. But honestly, it seems like a lot of the time they just can't be bothered, and sometimes they go about it in a fundamentally wrong way. That last part I know for sure from reading their prologues. Every prologue, or at the very least, every prologue at the start of a new series, begins in the most unimaginative place possible, at the beginning of time, or the beginning of the world. They only exist to give huge amounts of unnecessary and overstuffed exposition, not as a backstory to see how any of these events or characters might fit into the world. He straight up just explains each new world like a Wikipedia entry, and I just don't care. This is the first time I'm reading anything about your world. I don't care how it formed or how the gods got this particular piece of magic to work thousands of years ago. If it's actually relevant, then tell me during the story like a normal person. Seriously, read any of his prologues and tell me I'm wrong. Do it, you won't. In any case, I think I've exhausted the complaints I have about his shallow world building. Let's move on to another big ticket item.
I'm pretty sure everyone picked up what I was putting down earlier, so you all knew this was coming. If, however, by some miracle you did manage to get through my entire tirade about the Angarax and missed my little hint about this section, then surprise. First of all, I'm going to hit you with a scolding hot take that you won't get anywhere else on YouTube. Slavery is bad, actually. So, we as a society have known this for a long fucking time, and we should have known it for our entire existence, but you and I already know the words to this song. David and Lavid managed to botch the inclusion of slavery almost as hard as they botched the inclusion of just women in general. So the Nadraks have an interesting society. I already told you that they're the merchants of the Angarak world, and we've heard that they're super smelly and their towns are ugly, but what you might not know is that all Nadrak women are slaves. Just gonna let that one sit for a little bit. Okay, now that you've had enough time to say, wow, that's pretty gross, let me show you the evidence. Yarblek, Silk's Nadrak business partner, a fairly large part of the story and a friend to our main heroes, is a slave owner. How many slaves does he own? Well, just one.
Her name is Vela. You've actually heard me talk about her before. She's a sexy tavern dancer, but she also has knives that she's not afraid to use on any man that dares get too close. At the end of the series, she falls in love with Belden and convinces Yarblek to sell her to him, because she has a say in that decision and she gets half of the fee. She also says something very interesting when she gets sold. Yarblek, when you get back to Garog Nadrak, I want you to spread that word around. I want every woman in the kingdom for the next 100 years to cry herself to sleep every night just thinking about the price I brought. So, not only is this disturbing because she seems to relish in the fact that all of her fellow slaves will be jealous of her price, but it heavily implies that all Nadrak women are slaves. There's nothing in the text to contradict this, and there's only really one small passage in the Revan Codex that addresses it. Note on slaves. Among the Nadraks, slaves exist only for insurance purposes. Slaves are substitutes for Nadraks chosen for sacrifice. If you're chosen, buy a slave and send him, or her, instead. Thus, slaves are worked but not seriously mistreated. The freemen, miners, woodsmen, hunters, etc., are for the most part exempt because sacrifices are chosen from the clans. It's basically saying that Nadraks have slaves so that when the Grolim priests come in, they can just send their slaves off to be sacrificed instead. So they buy and sell male slaves too. That's equality for you. I don't know whether the Eddingses changed their minds in between writing this world-building almanac and the main series itself, but either way, it's not looking good. Also, it's pretty jarring that Belden, a disciple of Aldur, a minor character we're supposed to like, buys a slave from Yarblek, another minor character we're supposed to like. True, he immediately rips up her papers to set her free, but at that point, why buy her at all? Yarblek is supposed to be insanely rich, so rich that if he and Silk stopped trading in Meloria, apparently the entire Melorian economy would collapse. Don't even get me fucking started. So obviously not everyone is going to treat their slaves as well as Yarblek does. Surely our heroes recognise this fact and might do something to change this practice now that they know it exists. No? Okay, maybe they'll just voice their opinions and their disgust. No? Oh god, okay, what about just thinking about how fucked up it is? No? Jesus! No one says a fucking word about slavery here or anywhere else in the series. Also, it doesn't matter how well they treat their slaves, they're still slaves, just want to get that out of the way. In fact, not only do they not do anything about slavery here, but Belgarath, Polgara and Belden have all known about various forms of slavery throughout the world for thousands of years, and haven't done anything then either. But how do we know they knew? How do we know they ever had the opportunity to actually do anything? Maybe it's harder than you think, Josh. Maybe they tried, but they just couldn't get... No. Polgara, literally, willingly becomes a slave in her standalone novel. She goes to Garog Nadrak and she meets a slave woman, Ayala, who's a super sexy tavern dancer, but she has knives that she's not afraid to... Okay. Anyway, Polgara sees her dance and learns from her that slavery can be really empowering actually, because women like the attention of the drunken men they're dancing for. So she sorceries a guy into thinking he's her master. Or maybe that's not the right term. I'm a slave, mother. I can't just wander the streets as I please, can I? You're missing the point, Pol. Galak's your owner, not your master. Your property, not a slave. My mistake, she's property, not a slave, so yeah, he's her owner, right, of course. That's an important distinction, and definitely one that matters. So she can walk wherever she likes, I guess, but surely Dave and Lave aren't suggesting that slavery's good. Your collar gives you absolute freedom, and it tells everybody that if anyone interferes with you, Galak will have him killed. You've got more freedom here than you had as the Duchess of Arat. You can go anywhere you want to go, and you don't have to do anything you don't want to do. Nadrak women have more freedom than any other females in the whole world. Except wolves, of course. Oh god, oh Christ, they actually fucking did it. See, slaves are more free because you don't have to worry about duties and problems and families and taxes and stuff.
Slavery is so good!
In addition to being one of the worst and most disturbing takes in the entire series,
This line also supports the claim that all Nadrak women are slaves, which, again, never satisfactorily addressed by the text or our heroes. You literally say she's property. How can you claim that she has any freedom, let alone more freedom than other women who presumably are not slaves? Apparently, they get to choose who their owners sell them to, and if he doesn't want to sell, then flash those knives, girl, he'll have no choice. Okay, what if your owner doesn't let you have knives? What if you have knives, but your owner has bigger knives, or a sword? What if you can't use your knives because he'll beat the shit out of you if you try? What if your knives aren't enough to convince him, and he simply refuses to sell you? Are you gonna kill him? Can you, even? This weak little footnote that they've added to their version of slavery is meant to empower the women in question, to downplay the lack of action and the oppression. It doesn't. It raises more questions than it answers, and the idea that either Polgara or Poledra would ever buy into any of this is insulting to both their characters and the reader's intelligence. Also, if you needed any more evidence that all Nadrak women are slaves, there is a direct quote from one of our characters saying all Nadrak women are slaves. Here, Nadrak women are property, Pol. Everybody knows that. It's pretty cut and dry. So there you have it. Polgara didn't just know about slavery, she was a slave. She knew all about how slavery worked, saw all the other slaves around her and went, nah, this is fine. Good, even. So you might be wondering how Polgara frees herself from slavery. She's a sorceress, so she can just alter some memories, turn into a snowy owl, and fly away. Well, she can, but what she actually does is telepathically text Belgarath, her father, to come to Garog Nadrak, bring a shitload of gold, and buy her. So he knows about slavery too, and he doesn't give a shit either. Obviously, this specific textual proof is superfluous. We know that they've known for thousands of years because ostensibly they know everything. People have been spying on the Angaraks left, right and centre throughout all of these stories. Belgarath especially is obsessed with gathering information. He spent hundreds of years studying mountains, flowers and grass. You don't think he heard that Nadraks have slaves along the way? Or the Nyissans? They have an entire slave trade, but apparently that's not worthy of retribution. Polgara can go and turn Salmissa into a snake forever for one crime, but she can't lift a finger to do anything about a much more widespread one. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe Belgarath couldn't. Maybe I'm expecting too much from these characters and it's beyond their scope. Except that both of them change and reshape political landscapes all the time. Belgarath spends most of his time in his standalone novel running around the West, arranging marriages and alliances, trying to set up for things that he knows has to happen later in the piece. He basically helps the kingdoms form governments, especially the Alorn kingdoms where he all but chooses their leaders for their founding. He is massively respected, revered, and even feared throughout the entire world. He can arrange specific Tolnedran dynasties to be in power at specific times. He can squash political movements that rival the existing lines in the Alorn kingdoms he needs to preserve. He can even mobilize almost all of an entire continent to go to war, which he does several times. Could he not dip over to the Angarak kingdoms and discourage them from making slavery such a huge fucking deal? Even if you reckon his interference wouldn't work because the Angaraks are too set in their ways, or they hate him, or Torak's disciples would have just stopped him, he couldn't even try? And what about Nyissa? He can lead an entire war against them after they murdered the Revan king, but he can't do anything about slavery? What about Polgara? She orchestrates a revolution in Erendia, and there's a few chapters dedicated entirely to this plan. She rises to the title of Duchess and gets given her own land, and basically founds Sendaria. She frees her own people from the oppression of serfdom, and leads the way to encourage other Arendish nobles to do the same. It doesn't work, but at least she tries in Erendia. She doesn't try at all in Nyissa or Garog Nadrak. What about our protagonist, Garion? He's the King of Riva, the Overlord of the West, the Godslayer, the Chosen One. He's a powerful sorcerer and wields more political influence than anyone else in the entire world. What does he do when he learns about slavery in Nyissa or Garog Nadrak? Nothing.
He's on a council with the king of Garog Nadrak, and so are all the other kings and queens of the West. What are they doing about slavery? Nothing. All of our main characters are perfectly fine with slavery, and I can't even add the weak-ass corollary of until it happens to them, because it did happen to them, and they don't care. Okay, last chance. Althalus. In the first chapter, Althalus sees some slaves, and he acknowledges that slavery is bad. We've started well. Here's a chat to his good luck about never letting him become a slave. Okay. This makes perfect sense as some inner monologue, especially at the start of the book. We've acknowledged an issue. Slavery. We know our hero's stance. Ambivalent. Let's see where this goes. Later in the story, he poses as a slaver and buys a bunch of soldiers, pretending that he'll make them slaves, only to then set them free because he has to get to Eliar, one of the other main characters. That's a bit of progress. It's a lot better than the alternative, right? What's next? Nothing. There's no mention of any qualms or further run-ins with any slaves or slave No, nothing. It's fine for Althalus not to go out and free every slave that ever existed, or not to be the type of guy that even thinks about overhauling these political systems, but it feels slightly weird. I'm not saying that he has to take action like I expected the characters in the Belgariad to, but it's weird to draw attention to it so quickly and then just let it fizzle out completely. At this point, some of you may be noticing that this section of the video is very similar to Sean's Harry Potter video. That's true, but it's not intentional. I'm not trying to steal his talking points or to copy his formula. It just so happens that Dave and Lee incorporate slavery into their world in a very similar way to J.K. Rowling. They also have a very similar excuse for the persistence of slavery. House elves love being slaves. Nadrak women love being slaves too. They get heaps of attention, they get money when they're sold, they get to walk around unsupervised sometimes, maybe? That means they're super free, right? They can probably leave whenever they want. I mean, don't worry about the fact that they have slave collars and also slave papers, but that definitely wouldn't be a problem rolling up to a strange town without either of those things. Or, God forbid, with both of those things, but without your owner. Yeah, I'm sure no one would have a problem with that. In fact, I'm willing to say that J.K. Rowling, bigoted, smooth-brained neolib turf as she is, handled slavery better than David and Lee Eddings. In Harry Potter, yes, the house elves want to be slaves for some stupid fucking reason, but at least someone is trying to make a change to this oppressive, awful system. Someone is trying to free them. In the Belgariad, the Malorian and the rest, fucking crickets. Who here thinks that slavery is bad? Who here wants to do literally anything about it? Yeah, that's what I fucking thought. It's pretty hard to read some of these sections as a rational adult. As an oblivious white kid, I kinda skated over a lot of the major issues with these books, and I could probably even skate over some of the minor ones now, but at best ignoring slavery, and at worst kind of condoning it, is a bit of a stretch. And I'm just not that flexible. Do I think David and Lee Eddings actually thought slavery was good? I doubt it. I think it's far more likely that they just included these ideas about slavery before they had a good chance to properly think them through, and they just weren't cognizant at all of the world building and character implications this could have further down the line. I also hope that no one reading these books is going to take away the message that slavery is good. I just don't think that's a value that kids are absorbing. It is, however, another huge blow to the integrity and inherent goodness of these characters that we're being told are shining, heroic beacons of justice. How can they be? You can argue that it's not their responsibility to fix every problem with the world, that Garion can't rule kingdoms that aren't his. But I don't think that argument holds water. They're obsessed with fixing things. They spend thousands of years fixing things. There's no getting around it. Our main characters
are comfortable with slavery. And that brings us to something a little different.
There's one more twist, folks. Yeah, but Josh, you said there were no more twists.
I promise I'm done with the big twists now.
I lied.
I promise I'm done with the big twists now.
Yeah, but I just saw the clip and you played it again in like slow motion.
I lied again. I got you. Admit it. I fucking got you. I'm gonna stop doing this bit now, actually, because their crimes were really awful and I don't want to downplay what they did.
Before the Belgariad, before any of their publications, before the millions of dollars, David and Lee Eddings were convicted of child abuse and both spent time in prison. Quick trigger warning, I'm going to go into a bit of detail about what they did, and it's fairly unpleasant. Feel free to skip. In 1966, David and Judith Lee Eddings adopted a 6-month-old boy. They actually adopted a girl as well, but there's not a lot of information about her. In 1970, they were arrested, charged, tried, and found guilty of child abuse. They had been torturing their 4-year-old son. Who knows for how long. When the police found him, he had multiple bruises and other minor wounds. He was being kept in a makeshift cage in the basement. There were scratch marks on the wall, restraints on the toilet and bed, and a mirror installed on the kitchen steps through which David and Lee could monitor their son's cell. In this newspaper article, they've used the word pen in inverted commas, and I believe that from that description, even that is too generous. Police also found 2 wooden boards they believed the couple would use to beat him. David and Lee Eddings tortured this poor boy, a child that they adopted. There's really not much else to say about the awful things these 2 disgusting human beings inflicted on this child. If you want to read more about the incidents, I'll leave some links in the description. Many of you may be asking, how could they have possibly achieved such literary success from inside the walls of a prison? The answer is as simple as it is unfair. They each only spent 1 year in prison. 1 year for the torture of a 4-year-old child. Despite having researched and written this video already, even just saying that makes me furious. This chapter is why I feel so comfortable shitting on these books that I once loved. These were 2 truly terrible, deplorable people who didn't deserve a single cent of the millions they earned, and no literary contribution could ever make up for the crimes that they committed. But how did they become so successful if people knew that they'd spent time in prison for child abuse? Well, it was the 70s, people didn't really know, and the facts weren't widely known at all until after their deaths. That's the only solace I can take from this. Any purchase of these books cannot possibly fill their dead little pockets. Not to play armchair psychologist on 2 dead authors who, as previously established, I never met, but I feel like this explains some of the stranger parts of their work. There are so many characters who appear superficially good, heroic, and just, but if you dig a little further, you see that they are deeply flawed in disturbing and unintended ways. Like Barak. Also, almost every relationship is between a middle-aged man and a young woman half his age. That's not necessarily an indication of anything more sinister, but it's a strange theme to have, especially when you pair it with the constant sexualization of children. Now that we have all the information, let's move on.
I've kind of run out of big categories to sort my complaints into, so now I'm going to give you some more observations in dot point form. I have a note here which simply reads, Belgarath fucked a wolf. That seems like a good place to start. Yeah, Poledra, Belgarath's wife and Polgara's mother, was originally a wolf. She magics herself into human form, just like Belgarath magics himself into wolf form. So it's not quite as bad as I made it sound, but it is true. There's often this Marvel-style quipping during the fight scenes, which is alright some of the time, but it gets very tiresome, just like in actual Marvel movies. Garion kisses his cousin. Garion, Belgarath, and Silk do blackface. I didn't really have enough to say about it in the misogyny section, but in the Malorian there's this stupid twist where the bad guy is actually a woman. Oh my god, no way. I don't know if it was an outdated trope at the time, but it certainly is now. At one point, a wolf kind of tries to hook up with Garion when he's in wolf form, and that wolf then turns out to be his grandmother in the shittiest disguise of all time. So, there's that. I have a note here for Belgarath the Sorcerer that says, Belgarath, as a young boy, manages to stumble into the one old man living alone in the tower, who traps him inside with a magical stone door and feeds him and gives him a place to sleep, who isn't a pedophile. So that's pretty lucky. He's not super consistent with his language rules. I don't mean his made-up languages. I mean, there are a lot of characters who speak in this high style, these and thous, but they quite often lapse into you and your instead of thee and thy, and it gets a little jarring. He also does this for wolves. They all have this particular way of speaking. One thanks you, one is tired, but at a particular point in Belgarath the Sorcerer, just kind of throws it out the window. I thank you, I'm tired. Where'd the language rules go, man? There's this one character in Redemption of Althalis, Gare. You'll have heard me talk about him before. He is the most annoying character of all time. He only exists to disseminate Dave and Lee's world-building ideas in dialogue form. He is a walking Wikipedia article who only pauses in his info dumps to comment on how pretty the girls are. Also, he has some of the most infuriating dialogue I've ever read. I don't exactly understand what's going on when people get grown up. No human being in any fictional or real universe would ever put those words together in that order off the top of their head. There are a few examples in here of things I did really like though. Like this exchange. Too late, Rabas, the scar-faced soldier laughed harshly to the leader of the newcomers. Lembor doesn't need you anymore. He just came down with a bad case of dead. I don't know, I just really enjoyed that one. There's a few lines in Guardians of the West about how nobles who don't pay their taxes are total shitbag dickheads. Love that. Very based. And I swear there are more things I liked, but we'll get to them in the conclusion, which is coming right now. These books were a big part of my childhood. They helped fan the flames of my love for fantasy. I know my brother loved them too, and when I look online I can see even more people with similar stories and experiences. Nothing can take away the cozy days spent curled up with a book that you lost yourself in, or the memories of stories that whittled away the hours, especially not some random bloke's YouTube video. I'm not trying to undermine the enjoyment that so many people got from reading these books. I'm just detailing my experiences rereading them now. I'm sure some of you feel the same way, either about David and Lee specifically or about other authors that you've revisited as an adult. The memories are still there, but when you go back to recapture them, the nostalgia is gone. I'll admit that I probably ruined some of this rereading process by taking notes and focusing on some of the things that I did, but I didn't decide to make this video out of the blue. Going back to the Redemption of Althalis was brutal. It wasn't as good as I remember, and I couldn't quite get lost in it like I did before. I think that's because the problems, which it so readily wears on its sleeve, just get more and more uncomfortable as you go through the book. And a similar thing happens with the Belgariad and the Malorian. The racism, sexism, and general moral ambiguity gets stretched further and further as these series go on, and eventually you realise nothing will ever change. This character stagnation makes some of the books a real slog because none of them are narratively bold enough to make up for that one glaring issue. I do want to make one thing clear though. You're allowed to enjoy these books. You don't need me to tell you that, but it's true. Not only are David and Lee Eddings dead, so you can purchase and read them guilt-free, but you might be entering this world for completely different reasons than me. You might have different tastes, different expectations, different ideas of what constitutes too much or too little condemnation of rampant slavery. It's all relative. Please don't let me discourage you from enjoying something that you like if you do in fact like these books. Along that vein, I'm going to share some more things that I do enjoy about them. First of all, he really captured that spirit of adventure and wonder. We're seeing the world through the eyes of Garion, who apparently doesn't know a thing about anywhere but his farm. So the first time you read the Belgariad, you have that same sense of discovery that he does. There's a reason writers use this technique so often, especially for high fantasy. It's packed full of tropes and cliches, but it is by design, and like I said, some of these things are overused for a reason. In Sorceress of Darshiva, Chapter 10, Belgarath and Garion have transformed themselves into wolves. They're trying to lead the Fellowship through the woods to avoid hounds and other obstacles. They come up against a big hound, and they can't use any of their normal tricks or they'll be discovered. Now, David Lee actually managed to create a pretty tense scene here, especially given that the two characters involved are the most powerful sorcerers in the world. They give us a taste of some conflicts that can't be resolved with magic, and the planning that goes into that. Genuinely good stuff. There's some nice introspection in Belgarath the Sorcerer and Polgara the Sorceress as well. Both characters are effectively immortal, and there are several references throughout both books as to how this affects them, their ability to relate to people with regular lifespans, and how it basically dulls them around the edges. I thought this was a really nice touch, and sort of put a few things into perspective for each of them. There's also an excellent chapter in King of the Murgos. Chapter 11 follows some random bloke as he brings a deadly and contagious disease into Malzeth, the capital and biggest city of Meloria. It's a genuine banger of a chapter, and a massive departure from the rest of the series. He intros the illness and its horrifying symptoms well, and gives a really accurate depiction of the fast, hidden ways that contagious diseases can spread like wildfire. Misty wants to say something. Good stuff. It reads like the opening to Contagion, which I really enjoyed, and after the COVID pandemic, it hits even harder. Without any of our main cast or big set pieces to fall back on or weigh us down, I think this might be David Lee's best work. There's some beauty to the prose. You can tell that some places are really important to David and Lee. There are strong character moments to cheer for, and a nice, cozy feel throughout much of the quieter moments, making for easy reading. There's a lot to like about these books, and I'm not trying to take that away from anyone who still enjoys them. I'm not trying to ridicule anyone who feels this way either. Preferences are subjective, and some of the things I've talked about are going to matter more to some than others. I also want to reiterate that including racist or misogynistic characters obviously doesn't make you racist or misogynistic. When all of your characters spout the same questionable and sometimes outright bigoted values, however, you start asking questions. And when none of these things are ever addressed or challenged and are instead actively celebrated, you start drawing conclusions. I've been fairly brutal this video, and while I didn't love deconstructing and trashing something I used to enjoy, I think it's important to look at some of these things with a critical eye. I also don't feel bad for talking shit about David and Lee Eddings, for obvious reasons. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed watching this video. It's been a long time in the making, and as you can see, I've tried a few new things with this one. I hope I've conveyed my points properly, and that you can really see where I'm coming from. But feel free to let me know if you have any similar or differing opinions about these books or what I've said or these authors in the comments. I'd genuinely love to hear it. Thank you so much for sticking through this whole thing. Please hit like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you want to see future content, and have a good one.